Hey guys, welcome back to this Flutter game development series where we are making Spacescape, a 2D top-down space shooter using Flame Engine. In the previous video, I added this simple pause button to this game, on pressing which a nice little pause menu is displayed. And from here, we can resume the game, or we can go ahead and restart the game, or we can even exit to main menu. Now, so far, we have only a single type of player spaceship and single type of enemy spaceship in this game, which is not fun. So to make things interesting for players, I would like to provide multiple options for player spaceship and multiple types of enemy. And this video will be the first step towards achieving that goal. The actual spaceship selection menu will be added later, but in this video, we'll do all the groundwork needed to change player spaceship dynamically. For this video, we'll need the provider package. So I'll head over to the pub.dev page of provider and copy the dependency from installing tab. And back in pubspec.yaml of our project, I'll replace this Google Fonts package with provider package and save this file. Okay, so when I said that I want multiple spaceship options for player, I didn't mean just different sprites. I want each spaceship to have some unique set of parameters. And these parameters can be speed, strength, cost, and so on. To represent all such details about a spaceship, we need a separate class. So first, I'll create a folder called models under lib directory. And under models, I'll create a file called spaceship_details.dart. Now before we start writing code inside this file, let me quickly show you which sprites I'll be using for all the spaceship options. So I'll open up the sprite sheet we have in our assets/images folder. From all these sprites, I'll be using the first row as different types of player spaceships. Although these sprites are perfectly fine for use in game, I also want to display them on spaceship selection menu. And it turns out that if I use these sprites directly in Flutter widgets, their quality looks pretty bad. And that is why I'll be using better quality images to display the spaceships outside game world. Luckily, the asset pack that we are using provides better quality images for all the sprites. So if I open up the extracted assets folder that we downloaded at the beginning of this series, you can see that it contains a folder called PNG. Inside this, there is a folder called Retina, which contains all the sprites from the sprite sheet provided as single image file. And the ones that we are interested in right now are from spaceship_a.png to spaceship_h.png. So let's copy all these images into our assets/images folder. Okay, so now let's get back to the code. In the spaceship_details.dart file, I'll create a new class called spaceship. Each spaceship will have a unique name, so I'll add a final string to store that name. Next, each spaceship will have some in-game cost. So I'll add a final integer to store the cost. Then we also need a field to store speed of the spaceship. This field will be of type double. Then next, we need to store the sprite ID of each spaceship. The sprite ID is the same ID that we used in onload method of Spacescape game class while creating a new instance of player. Next, we will also store the path2 image asset which should be used while displaying spaceship outside the game world. This field will be of type string. And finally, I'll add an int to store the level of this spaceship. This level will be used to decide the strength of spaceship. Now I'll quickly create a constructor for this class which will take all the parameters as required parameters. Then next, to make it easier for us to identify the spaceship in code, I'll create a enum called spaceship types. Here, I'll add 8 unique names which will also be the names of the spaceships. Now, to make it easier to get all the details about a spaceship just by knowing its type, I'll create a static const map in spaceship class. And let's keep this as spaceship type instead of types. So this map will be between spaceship type and a spaceship object. I'll name this map as spaceship. And now we can define all the parameters for each spaceship type in this map. To save some time, I'm just going to paste in data from my development version of this project. You can see that I have mapped each and every spaceship type to an unique spaceship object. Also, we are getting some errors here because the map we are constructing is a constant map. So the constructor of Spaceship class will also have to be marked as const. And that completes our map. Next, let's add a static method to this class called getSpaceshipByType. This method will take a spaceship type as input and will return the corresponding spaceship object. But you can see that we are getting an error here. This is because the index operator can return null if given spaceship type does not exist in spaceship map. So in such case, I would like to return the default spaceship. This can be done by returning the value of first entry of spaceship's map by using the conditional operator. This means Canary will be the default spaceship for players. This completes our spaceship class. Next, we want a class which will hold all the details about player and player's progression. So again, I'll create a file under models directory called player_data.dart. This file will contain a class called playerData. As player data might change dynamically while the game is running, and we might want to rebuild widgets depending on some of those changes, it makes sense to derive this class from change notifier. So in this playerData class, the very first thing that we need to store is the spaceship type of player spaceship. Then next, we need to know which all spaceships are owned by player. For this, I'll use a list of spaceship types. Next, we might want to store player's high score and amount of money available. For this, I'll use two integers. These are all the things that I can think of right now, but if needed, we can easily add more fields to this class. So let's quickly add all these as required parameters to playerData's constructor. Now the thing with playerData is that it will have to be stored persistently on device. This will allow us to track players' progress across sessions. And I'll be using Hive to store playerData as map. This means at some point we'll have to read the data back from Hive and construct an object of playerData. So for this, I'll create a named constructor called fromMap, and it will take a map of string to dynamic as input. And now I'll just extract out values for required keys from this map and store them in fields of playerData. Most of them are trivial, except the list of owned spaceships. To generate that list, I'll first map each element of stored list into spaceship type, and then I'll call .toList to convert it into a list. Now one final thing that we need in playerData class is some default data. This data will be required when users launch the game for the first time. At first launch, no persistent data will be present on device, and at that time, we'll use default data to construct our initial player data. So here, I'll create a static map called default data with some sensible default values. And that is it. We have now completed everything required for player data creation. Now all we have to do is create an instance of player data at the beginning of the app and expose it to rest of the app. So now let's go to the main.dart file. Here I'll wrap material app inside a change notifier provider. In this provider, we'll have to create a new instance of player data. And for creating this instance, I'll use playerdata.fromMap constructor. As storing and reading persistent data will be covered in a future video, I'll just use the playerdata.defaultData as input to fromMap. And this should be enough to generate a default player data instance. Now all we have to do is get hold of this data inside our game and use it to generate player component. So let's go to game.dart file. Here in onload method, you can see that we initialize player component with a hard-coded sprite. But now we have to make this dynamic and load correct sprite depending on the current player data. So for that, let's go to the player class in player.dart file. Here I'll add two new fields. One will be to store spaceship type of player, and the second one will be to store the actual spaceship details. And notice that I'm only keeping spaceship type as public because I don't want other objects to be able to directly modify spaceship data from outside this class. Next, I'll add spaceship type as a required property in player's constructor. And once we have spaceship type, we can easily initialize this .spaceship using the getSpaceshipByType method from spaceship class. And to show you an example of how this spaceship data will be used, I'll replace the hard-coded speed of player in update method with spaceship.speed. And that is it. Now we can remove the speed field completely from player class. Now back in game.dart file, we'll have to provide a spaceship type to player component. I can directly set this to default spaceship.canary, but then this and the sprite ID used below this will not remain in sync. So I'll refactor this a little to first get spaceship data for default spaceship type. And now the spaceship type and the sprite ID of corresponding spaceship can be used in player's constructor. A natural question to ask at this point is, why are we still sending a hard-coded spaceship type to player component? Shouldn't we be getting the current spaceship type from player data that we created at the start of the app? And the reason why we are doing it this way is that there is no way to get current player data inside onload method. And this is because to get the player data, we need a valid build context. Although Flame provides us with a build context, it gets set only when the game instance is attached to Flutter's widget tree. In short, build context is null inside onload method. So to get hold of current player data, we'll have to override the onAttach method in Spacescape game class. Inside this method, first I'll make sure that build context is not null. And if that is true, we can use provider.off method to get player data from build context. We store it in a variable called player data. And as we have made sure that build context will never be null inside this block, I'll add a not at the end of build context so that it gets casted to a non-nullable. Also, one important thing, we don't want to register ourselves as a listener here. So I'll just set the optional listen parameter to false. Now once we have the required player data, all we have to do is ask player component to update its spaceship type, spaceship data and sprite with this player data. So for this, I'll go to player.dart file and add a new method in player class. This method will take a spaceship type as input and set it as current spaceship type. Then next, I'll update this .spaceship with current spaceship using getSpaceshipByType method of spaceship class. And finally, I'll update the sprite of this component with sprite ID of the updated spaceship. Now back in game.dart file, we can just call setSpaceshipType method on player and pass in the spaceship type from player data. And that is it. Now let's build and run this code to see if everything is working. And as you can see, the player sprite has indeed changed to the very first sprite from our sprite sheet. Now just to simulate a case where player has changed the spaceship, I'll go to the default data map in player_data.dart and change the current spaceship type to Dusky. Now let's hot restart and see if the sprite updates. And yes, the player sprite has changed again. Also, the player speed is getting picked correctly depending on the spaceship type. So that was it for this video. Now we have a way to change player spaceship along with all of its parameters just by changing the spaceship type. And in the next video, I'll probably add a proper spaceship selection menu. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. If you did, do hit that like button and maybe consider subscribing for more such content. I hope to see you in the next one.